this important conversation, that we're hosting on confronting anti-AAPI hate in the pre and post-COVID era. The School of Social Sciences has organized a number of events since the killings in Atlanta, but also, as you know, the kind of violence and anti-Asian and Pacific Islander hate that we're seeing in this country is not new. This country has a very long and tragic history of such incidents, and even, of course, as many of you here know, encoded into our very legal structure going back to the 19th century, if not before. So this is an important inflection point, obviously, for the country and for our campus community. And so last week we had a panel on action and organizing with representatives from journalism, politics, and the nonprofit and advocacy sector. Today, my associate dean and colleague Jeanett Castellanos will be leading us in another conversation, but I just wanted to welcome everyone and thank you for being here. This session is being recorded, and the recording will be available later on the Social Sciences website. Thank you to all of the panelists. And Jeanett, I will now turn it over to you.
Thank you, Dean Maurer. It's a pleasure to be here today for such an important event. It is definitely an honor and an important cause for us to come together and have these discussions. We have a very wonderful panel, which I'm very excited to welcome and introduce. And we will have I think, a very short time, because an hour doesn't really give us a lot, but just at least some conversation around this important matter. And so I'm going to start off by introducing Dr. Kevin Nadal. He is a professor of psychology, both at John Jay College of Criminal Justice and Graduate Center at the City University of New York. He received his doctorate in counseling psychology from Columbia University and is one of the leading researchers examining microaggressions and other forms of discrimination and how those issues impact mental health. For those of you who have already known Dr. Nadal, he is a famous researcher who has over hundreds of publications, 10 books. And of course, as his mentor, I have to, be very, very proud of him and so super excited that he's joining us today. It is our honor to have Dr. Nadal in the house. We also are honored to have Dr. Long Bui, who's an amazing associate professor with us in the Department of Global and International Studies. I personally see Dr. Long Bui as one of my own colleagues who I esteem very highly. His research is around refugee studies and media representations of race, gender, and sexuality. He himself has a number of books, and I welcome Dr. Bui as well. And we also want to welcome, there you are, Elizabeth Rubio. Elizabeth Hannah Rubio is receiving her doctorate in cultural anthropology here with us at UC Irvine. Building on her background as a community organizer, she writes about the fraught politics of multicultural coalition building in immigrant justice spaces and the complexities of thinking immigration justice through an abolitionist lens. So welcome everybody, these great panelists. Welcome all of you. We don't quite see you yet. Are we going to ever see the people who have joined us, Fran, or is it just going to be us seeing ourselves?
No, it will be the panelists and you today.
Okay, so welcome all of you who have joined us. It's a pleasure. And with that said, I'm going to go ahead and start off with a few questions. We have numerous questions which we're going to be addressing. And the way that we'll do this, team, is we'll probably start off with maybe Kevin, and then from there, maybe Long can respond, and then Elizabeth, and you guys will kind of get the flow of this, and we'll go through a few of the questions. Probably not all the ones that I wrote, but a few. Okay, so we'll start off by discussing some of the themes that we are hearing and experiencing, witnessing, and also internalizing in the context of race in this country. And so I'd like that maybe you can all share with us a little bit about what we really need to understand about the AAPI narrative, particularly here in the United States. And if you can provide us an example that can give us some information about perhaps your own narrative your scholarship, a combination of the two, in the context of, you know, what we need to be aware of as we begin this conversation about AAPI and these not recent, because I believe that there's a long history, right, of oppression and marginalization and racism against the AAPI community, but the most recent statistics that we're seeing rising as our time is moving forward.
Sure. I'll start. First of all, I want to say thank you to Dr. Castellanos, Jeanett, my mentor, the person why I am here today in all these capacities, because she saw something in me that I didn't see in myself as an undergraduate. And so I always have to say thank you very much, Maurer, salamat, mil gracias for all that you've done for me and for hundreds of students in UCI and EATR specifically. So, you know, I'm really, you know, happy to be here, but also the circumstances in which we're here are not great. That we're in a time where we're experiencing an uptake in Asian American violence or anti-Asian American violence. But to what you had said, as well as to what Dean Maurer had said, that this isn't new. The history of Asian American violence is as old as the history of what is now known as the United States. The first federal immigration laws that restricted the immigration from people coming into this country based on race was towards Asian people, and the Chinese Exclusion Act or the Asian Exclusion Act of 1882. But even before that, the Page Act of 1875, which prevented Chinese American women from coming here because they were presumed to all be sex workers. And so we recognize that this history has been a long part of Asian American experiences. We know that the Los Angeles or the Chinese massacre in California, the Watsonville riots up towards Filipinos in the 1930s, to Japanese internment during World War II. But you know, one of the things that really bothers me when people talk about this rise in anti-Asian violence is that they're not talking about the rise in anti-Asian violence that occurred after 9/11. That South Asians, Muslim people, and people who were perceived as Muslim, which included a lot of South Asian people and Sikhs particularly, that they experienced violence. And that happened even more so after the 2016 election. And so when we think about anti-Asian violence, we have to really deconstruct what that means, who's included in that narrative. Are we only caring about this anti-Asian violence when it affects East Asians? And is it because of the coronavirus and pandemic that people are more aware of this? And where was a lot of this rage when there was anti-Asian violence after 9/11? I also think it's really important that we really are careful and pay attention to language. I know that, you know, most people, so it's not just here, we say anti-AAPI, but are we really thinking about Pacific Islanders in this narrative? I don't know. I don't know how people self-identify, but I don't know that there are any Pacific Islanders on this panel. And so when we think about, you know, what is considered AAPI? Are we trying to be inclusive by including Pacific Islanders, but then not actually talking about them? Or are we really seeing this anti-Pacific Islander violence, which still exists? There was a recent killing of a Micronesian young man in Hawaii just last week. And so anti-Pacific Islander violence does exist, but it might not necessarily be the types of anti-Asian violence that we're seeing across the country. So with that, I think one of the things that is so important is to recognize that the diversity of what it means to be Asian American. Asian American captures 40 or 50 different unique ethnic groups in the United States. And as a result of that diversity, Asian American people may have various ways that they may encounter anti-Asian hate violence. East Asians might have experienced an increase in hate violence as a result of COVID-19 and some of the racist rhetoric that had been really spewed by the leaders of our federal government for the past year. We also have to recognize that this violence, while it might be more visible now, was occurring ever since the start of the pandemic in March of 2020. And that just simply wasn't receiving as much news coverage. I think for me as a Filipino American, it's important to acknowledge that Filipino people have experienced lots of anti-Asian violence since the history of us becoming settlers here in this country, or what is now known as this country. You know, some of the research it found was that Filipinos were among the Asian groups that experienced lots of hate crimes and violence even prior to COVID-19. And so again, like, where was the outrage when that was happening to some of our communities back then? You know, I think we have to think about all of our intersectionalities, including gender, gender identity, sexual orientation, social class, immigration status, language, access and ability, physical ability, disability, mental health ability and disability. All of those things affect the various ways that people experience violence. You know, I just think it's something that I'm happy people are talking about. And then, to be quite honest, I'm like quite frustrated that people are finally talking about it. You know, I think that that's something that I wish that people were much more aware of. Is just, you know, why does it take for people to be killed for people to care about this? Yes, it was horrible that 8 people, mostly Asian women, were killed in Atlanta. But prior to that, there were at least 3 or 4 Asian people that were killed in other circumstances, and people still didn't believe that anti-Asian violence had existed, you know, even though these 3 people or 4 people had died this past year. I don't know how many more people are going to have to die in order for people to care more, but I think that's something that I want to bring to the table. And then the last thing that I want to bring to the table is just understanding that everything that's happening to Asian American people right now is all under this umbrella of white supremacy. That people who care about anti-Asian violence need to also care about anti-Black violence, need to also care about anti-Latinx violence, need to also care about anti-Indigenous violence. All groups who have experienced lots of violence historically and even recently. And so even, you know, this past week with the trials of Derek Chauvin, as well as the recent murder of Daunte Wright. I am as outraged about that as I am about, you know, all of the different killings and assaults on Asian American people. So we can't think about these things in silos. We have to think about how all of these things are under this guise of white supremacy, and that we really need to tackle all of these things that all intersectionally, instead of just looking at them as individual problems. So I'll stop there, but thank you again so much for having me on this panel.
Thank you so much.
I think I'm next, right? Dr. C. So Dr. C is my mentor. Thank you all for coming. I know everyone's busy. Thank you for that, Kevin. I'm going to build off what you say. American white supremacy is global white supremacy. So as a global and international studies scholar who majored as an Asian American studies major when I was an undergrad at UC Irvine, I understand the implications of all these things in a global international context. For instance, California was the first state to ban Chinese, which ricocheted and created a national law to ban all Chinese, even though there were not any Chinese in like Wyoming or other places. And then the influence of California upon Australia, and United States, and Australia, New Zealand, other countries try to copy United States, or United States pressure countries like Canada and Mexico to ban Asians as well. So what we're understanding here is that anti-Asian violence is happening all around the world, not just the US, but we're talking Kenya, we're talking in South Africa, we're talking in France, in England, and it's happening, and we're kind of at the hub of all of this. At the same time, we can't just focus on American exceptionalism, right? At the same time, I want to say that the anti-Asian violence also happens in Asian countries. During the global pandemic, a lot of Chinese were pretty much excoriated and basically attacked in Asian countries, right? This is a history of, for instance, South Asian countries pushing out the Chinese or other groups that they blame when they want to hate the Chinese government. So in order to understand anti-Asian violence, it has to be global in scope, because the idea of race is a global phenomenon that's not simply tied to nation states, right? And that's why, like for instance, Trump's rhetoric was the one that helped promote the New Zealand massacre. So if we're going to talk about this, the global pandemic, we talk about racism, but I also want to think about how, like for instance, internationally, the 8 people killed in Atlanta were like Korean, and one of them was a teacher in South Korea, but then she came here and she had to do body work, and to survive, she didn't tell her children because she was so embarrassed. So one thing we don't want to know is that in order to understand white supremacy, we also include Asian patriarchy, because Asian patriarchy is a huge, big problem of why Asian women are so vulnerable. It's not just against white men, but Asian men are also increasingly responsible for that. So South Korea, for example, is a country, as we all know, South Korea is wealthy, but it's the largest gender pay gap of any developed high income country in the world. That means that Korean women can go to college at the same rate as men and have a massive disparity in terms of income wages. That informs the economic precarity that carries them from South Korea to the United States. All of that chases them, and which leaves them in a vulnerable spot. This is very personal to me because my mother, she's not Korean, she's Vietnamese, came from the war. But my mother only has a 3rd grade education, and she currently works in a Asian spa salon, and she can't afford rent, so she lives in her workplace. So for me, it's very personal why when I think about what the violence is happening, it can't be spectacularized. It's everyday violence. It's a slow violence that breaks down your bodies. For instance, as the only Southeast Asian American professor in the School of Social Science, I have to represent for the Southeast Asians. In California, the largest population of Asians in the prisons are Vietnamese. The second is Filipinx. The third is Pacific Islanders. If we're gonna talk about anti-Asian violence, it's hitting the tropical, the brown Asians, the Asians that don't get mentioned, the other Asians very often. So we cannot lump all Asians together. It has to be both distributed and differentiated at the same time as we recognize our common values and common cause. So that's my thing, and I want to give it the floor over to Liz before we talk some more questions.
Thanks so much to Kevin and Long, and thank you so much to everyone for being here. In a lot of ways, you all set up perfectly what I want to say, because Kevin really addressed the question of who we're talking about when we talk about anti-Asian violence, and Long talked about the often obscured factors that go into producing this violence on a global level. In my kind of intervention that I want to make is, what do we even mean by hate? When we say, and this is, I basically want to lay out why I feel, I'm sorry, my dog is barking, why I feel a kind of way about the Stop AAPI Hate hashtag. Because I think it does a lot of work, and the way that the narratives kind of circulate in popular media is confusing interpersonal violence and obscuring, like centering on interpersonal violence and decentering state violence. So I think it was the day before the Atlanta killings, the Biden administration authorized a flight of 33 Vietnamese American refugees to be deported to Vietnam, many of whom came over as refugees, spent years in refugee camps, etc. Right? This is and this is not my narrative. This is what Vietnamese American activists in Orange County, this is the connections that they're drawing. This is anti-Asian violence. So Naomi Murakawa, who's an abolitionist, critical theorist, a political scientist, she has in her book kind of really drawn out how so-called hate crime legislation has often been a way for kind of politicians and public figures and whatnot to provide the veneer of action while actually obscuring all of the other ways that state violence is adding into this narrative, right? So Biden on the one hand is making all of these wonderful announcements about how we need to stop AAPI hate and using the hashtag, and at the same time, obscuring these larger violences of deportation, of the continuing war, et cetera. In terms of a personal narrative, like, my mom has been living in New York since she migrated from South Korea 40 years ago. Like, sure, I'm really worried about her getting attacked on the street, but I'm also worried about the conditions of war that brought her here in the first place. And it really gets, and then to propose that the solution to this, in calling it hate, which really doesn't evoke any sort of specific political platform or definition of what we mean by hate, it then makes it seem like the best solution is hate crime legislation, which, if we think about it in a totality, is actually emboldening the same carceral state that's producing these other forms of violence that are obscured by this kind of ambiguous notion of AAPI hate. So I really want to kind of push the narrative of, like, let's say stop imperialism in Asia, stop criminalizing sex work, these very specific things that I think when we get to the question of intersectionality and solidarity creates much more space for connection than what kind of a more narrow vision that we're seeing come out. Yeah, so I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Liz. And I think actually on that same kind of note, we'll go to that number 3 question, right? Because we're already beginning to address the impact that these type of violence has had on the community. Let's go ahead and begin to have the conversation around the importance of discussing and acknowledging and understanding the role of intersecting oppressions, right? Let's go ahead and have you highlight the impact of how discrimination and racism, what that impact is when people have multiple minoritized identities, right? And then how is this relevant in the most recent attacks, and more importantly, and equally important, the understanding of how these experiences have an impact and an output.
Can we do a different order? So maybe Long go first.
Absolutely.
Okay.
We can actually rotate to make it,
Perfect.
Right,
Perfect.
great. Thank you.
Thanks for volunteering for me. Okay. Okay. Intersectional. I think of relational first. For instance, like two months before the Atlantic shooting, a black trans woman was shot and killed in Atlanta. Bianca Blanc, and she basically was killed. And last year was the most deadliest year for trans folks, mostly trans women and trans people of color. So in order to understand the intersectionality things, like as Liz was saying, it's economic precarity that's mixed with the criminalization of sex work. And so this type of body work isn't always sex work. We also have to criminalize and delink them at the same time. So I think of it just not just intersectionally, but relationally. For instance, Georgia seems to always be in the news these days, from voter suppression to the Senate. But also, Georgia was the seat of a Supreme Court case that basically pushed out all of the Native American tribes of that area, from the Cherokee and the Creek and all of them, and pushed them away from the ancestral homes. And the Supreme Court at that time said, 1831, this is your legitimate land. Sorry, United States, you can't push them off. Andrew Jackson came in with the army at gunpoint and pushed everyone out. And so the idea of gun shootings in Georgia is not new, because it's part of the manifestation of violent histories and legacies that Georgia and the South, because I am from the South, I'm from Texas, is something that we're very aware of. And so when we think about intersectionality, I also want to add also relationality at the same time. But for women, the fact that 68% of the people being attacked right now are women, or they're the elderly, tells us that there is something related to misogyny that we're not addressing so much when we talk about anti-Asian violence. And I think that's why, if you notice the social media cues, I think people at first thought the Chinese Exclusion Act was the first federally exclusive. That's a narrative that's spun to us and taught to us even in high school. That is not accurately, historically accurate. It's the Page Act that's the first restrictive one. So if we're going to be, it seems like if women are involved, then all of a sudden they're not part of history. So the intersectionality is important because it's both something that's unknown, but it's also part of our history that we don't know, because the ways that women are left out of the narrative. So I just want to put in both history is very important, because intersectionality is something that will help us give a better, accurate understanding of what actually has transpired in the world.
Okay, I'll go. Yeah, thank you for that, Long. And I think about a lot, in terms of the man in Oakland who was beaten while he was collecting cans. the woman in doing the body work. These are working class people. And when we, again, put everything under this kind of unifying mantle of, anti-Asian violence, we then, like, I'm always thinking, because I, study activists and I study what activists think about what liberation is, right? So I'm constantly thinking about this. So when we define the problem in that way, it leads us to solutions, again, that end up putting those same people that we seek to protect or whatever in even more precarious situations, right? So when we conflate, anti-Asian violence, we need an Asian American in Biden's cabinet. We need more Asian American Capitol executives. Rich Asian Americans like Daniel Day Kim coming out and literally putting a bounty on the heads of the attackers, right? Literally a bounty. We obscure that some of those same things that are producing these institutions that we're calling to have more Asian representation in are the same institutions that are oppressing folks like the people murdered in Atlanta, or folks like the Oakland can collector, right? So again, I'm going to keep saying this and everyone's going to get sick of me, but like, we need to be a little bit more specific when we use our hashtags, right? Well, that's it together.
Thank you. I'm a psychologist, so I just have to process. This is an amazing panel. Thank you for putting me on this panel. I'm enjoying it. We're not just talking about the things that people may want to hear, but things that we know are important. And I am like just snapping and clapping and nodding my head with everything that Liz and Long have been saying. So what do I add? I mean, I think one of the things that I would like to add is the intersectionality that comes with having both privileged identities and historically marginalized identities. I think that there is something to be said about, to what Liz had just mentioned, this, or alluded to, this anti-Blackness that is really coming out within Asian American communities, that has always been there, but is now like, just kind of casually and vocally coming out in terms of wanting to get all of these perpetrators of hate violence, putting bounties, rewards for catching, these criminals. And some of like, you even just go to my Instagram page, anytime I write about anything that relates to anti-Blackness, the amount of perhaps trolls, perhaps real people who then perpetuate some of that anti-Blackness is really disheartening, that I've had to turn comments off on a lot of these posts. And so, I think that's a conversation that needs to be had within Asian American communities. I think this conversation needs to be had now, as well as a conversation that should have been had years ago, right? The fact that someone like Daniel Day Kim, who, and I don't want to just name him, but others who have done this in certain ways, that they're coming to this conversation with that mindset means that they haven't done the work to think about their privilege and their proximity to whiteness and their anti-Blackness, or even just the ways that they become complicit in white supremacy, and the ways that they may have internalized this model minority, this us versus them, this Asian people are good, Black people, brown people, other Indigenous people are bad. And so I think that's a really important intersectionality to think about. I also want to just, snap a lot to what Liz had mentioned in terms of just hate crime law and the way that that's been even approached within Asian American communities. I've been fluctuating between saying community and communities, because I don't believe there's a homogenous Asian American community, but rather that there are communities of us. But within Asian American communities, that is the go-to, to go to this sense of the police are going to protect us, and that we need to increase hate crime legislation, that we need to criminalize these people who are attacking, as opposed to understanding some of the other factors that may be involved in all of this. It's especially problematic when the people who are the alleged assailants in some of these attacks are not just people of color or Black people specifically, but especially if they are Black people who tend to have a history of either incarceration or a history of mental illness, or both. And so understanding what are some of the systemic factors that may have contributed to this dynamic, all under the guise of white supremacy, as opposed to what both Long and Liz had talked about, not that these are not just individualized incidents. These are all trends that are part of this greater problem, right? For me, I've been talking a lot, in media about the problems with hate crime legislation, which people are quite surprised about, because they're like, you are this LGBTQ activist. Don't you want people to be to pay for engaging in any sort of hate violence, and wasn't it 10 years ago that you were advocating for LGBTQ hate violence, that that there needs to be this legislation? And maybe 10 years ago I was, because 10 years ago it wasn't legal for hate violence to be applied to LGBTQ folks, that people were getting away with these anti-LGBTQ hate crimes because that law wasn't even passed until 2009, and wasn't practiced clearly until well into 2011, 2012. I say that because my views have changed, because what I've noticed over the past 10 years and with my research and my scholarship is that hate crime legislation, not only, to Liz's point, promotes and perpetuates the carceral state, but it's been used primarily on Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. And it hasn't been used on the white people to which people may presume that hate crime legislation was used on. And so let me just paint a picture of what this means. The Atlanta shootings, as of this past week, the police chief was saying, or the various police chiefs were saying, that these were not considered hate crimes, that they didn't have any reason to believe that these were hate crimes, because the perpetrator said that it wasn't because of their race or their gender. And so we believe him. And so therefore it's not a hate crime. Yet a lot of these more randomized assaults that are happening on the streets by people who tend to have mental illness that are not premeditated are going to be labeled as hate crimes. And so now those folks who are arrested and convicted of those hate crimes, most who are Black, will be charged as such. And so then perpetuating the amount of BIPOC folks in the criminal justice system versus these white supremacist, premeditated hate violence perpetrators. We believe them that those aren't hate crimes. As another example, the Orlando Pulse massacre in 2016, in which 49 people were killed at a nightclub in Orlando, who were majority queer or trans-identified, majority Latinx, majority Puerto Rican descent, in which the perpetrator drove over 100 miles to target this club, and specifically chose Saturday, which was Latin night, and killed all of these people, that even though he then ended up getting killed himself, that the FBI did not label that as a hate crime, because there was not enough evidence to support that as being a hate crime. And so what is hate crime legislation even doing if people where it is clearly identified as hate, based on the letter of the law, it's that you have to have like written, documented history of your hate violence. But if somebody knows to plan an execution of dozens of people, maybe they know not to leave a trace of all of their anti-LGBTQ or Latinx biases. And so, these are just some things for us to think about, that the justice system is allegedly supposed to protect people, but in reality, perhaps it is protecting only certain groups of people. And if it continues to just criminalize historically marginalized groups, then is it something that we should really even still believe in? And so, abolition is the way to go.
Thank you all. I think that was great in the context of intersectionality. Each of you spent some good amount of time. Hopefully the audience really feels the same. So on that same kind of conversation that you're all having around white supremacists, right, and what they're doing and their attitudes, As you saw, there's a question here that we formulated that has to do with the most recent kind of propaganda that was put in all these homes in Newport Beach. And the propaganda basically said, you know, it was put out by the KKK, and the flyers basically read, help fight cultural genocide, to fight the erasure of whites in textbooks. So with that kind of in mind, how important are coalitions across BIPOC groups? And how can we or our students build authentic and lasting solidarity in a collective effort to disrupt racism?
I'm happy. I think it's my turn to go first on this one. Okay, I'm happy to do this one because this is like right up my alley. So obviously very important to have coalitions. I, again, like worry about how sometimes especially in, you know, I just wrote a paper about this, that like in, you know, what was the immediate reaction in kind of the summer of uprisings in 2020, right? Like folks got flooded with these, you know, anti-racist reading lists that really like held out the tenuous premise that one could learn through individualized behavior correction, that you can attain a state of anti-racist purity, which is a myth. Because if we believe that white supremacy and anti-Blackness, which aren't the same things, are not these things that are necessarily discernible in KKK signs put on your door, right? But in all of these other ways, then we have to also believe that we as individuals cannot reach individualized anti-racist purity, and that may not be the most desirable thing anyway, right? What I worry about is when that selling point starts to get circulated within coalition spaces that otherwise are doing transformative and revolutionary work, and kind of gets consolidated into what I call like a how-to repertoire, where the kind of listing of certain historical moments of Asian Black solidarity, or these kind of, you know, one of my colleagues called it like the model of white liberal allyship that is really detached from the kind of like anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist, revolutionary solidarities of, you know, Black Panthers traveling to China to learn about Mao, and, you know, and not to romanticize that time either. It's not like, you know, there was this perfect moment ever. But I think when we get into these kind of more performative talking points, then we lose the kind of struggle work that needs to happen in mutual aid spaces, in self-defense spaces, et cetera. And one is kind of confused with the other. And I think, again, the like same organizations, and it's funny because I'm like writing this as part of the epilogue to my dissertation. Like I'm literally archiving the receipts of like the same Asian American organizations that in June 2020 were releasing statements saying, you know, we stand in solidarity with Black Lives Matter, are the same ones now that are saying we need more hate crime legislation. We need to up the statutes. We need to, you know what I mean? So obviously coalition we can't do anything without coalition. But I think that there needs to be an examination of what we mean by that. Yeah.
I'm going to build off Liz's comments to talk about, we tend to focus on like right now the KK is trying to march and prepare, but that's very spectacularized violence that is so rare. Like when was the last time people remember the KK rally? I mean, they're there, but they know they're outnumbered. But then I just think about the fact that in all the years from 9th grade to 12th grade, none of my English teachers taught one person of color. Not one person of color. And when I confronted my teachers, they thought I was being unruly and difficult. So when I'm talking about white supremacy, we're not talking about the KKK. We're talking about the infiltration of the system that upon it which is built, and the fact that POC can participate in that system. For instance, I've been in contact with a lot of student groups. They want to create Asian American studies. They've been fighting for years for it. I've been trying to help Soka University, the students there, the Buddhist one next to UCI, Vassar College, Yale University. Also, many students have contacted me like, how do we get Asian American studies? And I told them, why are you fighting just for Asian American studies? Like this, like because we want to be represented. I said, that's great, but are you fighting for Native American studies? Are you fighting for Chicano Latinx studies? And they look at you and they don't know what to do. I was like, I get it. You're from one of the most segregated generations in history because of the ways that racial gentrification and segregation happen. But you have to fight for it. If you fight for Native American studies and Chicano studies and Asian American studies and Black studies, you can't lose. You can't lose because they can't ignore you now saying that, oh, we don't care about Asians. Now they have to say we don't support all people of color. And will administration how would you articulate, how would they frame that opposition, you know? So the students didn't understand coalition building because most of them didn't grow up in those neighborhoods. I only grew up in Black, brown neighborhoods. So when I hear Asian American groups and Asian American individuals say they want solidarity, but they don't know any, and I'm not saying it's not disingenuous, but there's a weird alienation that happens of allyship, but not knowing anybody personally. And the difficult word coalition isn't really allyship. It isn't people, it's friendship, it's love. If people know and love you, that's how coalitions are built. People come to your cause because they like you. They know you and your histories and your fantasies and your desires and your hopes and wishes, not because you put out pithy statements saying you support them too. You're still alienated. So the only way to build coalition is that you get down to the nitty-gritty of the interpersonal. Like for instance, when I taught at Vassar College, I know that a lot of Black faculty didn't have the resources to get together. So I asked the school for funding for thousands of dollars to just free dinner for all faculty, for faculty of color, Black faculty, like just to kick it. And so I was like, y'all gonna kick it on the school's dime just to hang out, and those social spaces were enough for them. But I built these networks for POC, and that's why it's very important to understand that coalition building is not just, as we learned from the feminist movement, the personal is political, right, folks? So.
I could just listen to both of you talk for hours. This is amazing. You know, what else I can add? I mean, I appreciate what both of you have said. My initial reaction was aligned to what Long was saying in terms of looking at the history of solidarity and learning from that history. Ethnic studies is around because of the Third World Liberation Front, in which people of all racial minority groups in San Francisco State got together and fought collectively for ethnic studies. So the same thing has to be done when we think about all of our issues that we are advocating for. I think we also cannot lose sight on what solidarity really means. It can't be what Liz had talked about, what people are doing in terms of saying Black Lives Matter, but then promoting the carceral state. We can't do that. And we have to understand how systems of oppression affect all of us. And even when it's hard, you know, like one of the things that I'm really trying to understand is, are these Asian American people who are asking for more police presence? I get it. They're feeling afraid. They're feeling fearful. They've been socialized and colonized to believe that the police are there to help us. And so I'm trying to empathize with that. And at the same time, sometimes it just takes a little bit of conversation with them. You know, a lot of folks who I know in my personal life who are immigrants, who have, you know, been colonized to believe that the government is there to help us. It just takes a few reminders of how governments have been corrupt across many of our communities and our countries of origin. A few reminders of how the American government and states have been really, you know, oppressive towards all of our different groups. For people to start to, you know, to challenge some of these thoughts that they believe to be true and factual, as opposed to, you know, actually being quite problematic and even oppressive and hurtful to our own communities. You know, a lot of times immigrants have a difficult time coming to terms with the fact that this country that many of them moved for or moved towards in order to find opportunities and to build their American dream, or to build a life that they don't think that they could have had in their countries of origin. Sometimes it's hard for them to realize that that system is actually really hurtful and harmful to them. And it's in many ways very similar to survivors of any sort of traumatic, abusive relationship. It takes a long time to realize that the people that are supposed to protect you, the people that you believed are providing you with something, that they actually are hurtful and harmful. And sometimes it takes that extra, just conversation and stepping outside of the box to make some of those connections. And so I think that's something that's really important for us to have. Even when we're so tired, even when I don't want to hear it from people, that's a conversation. And for me, I think one of the things that I've been trying to do is to delegate a lot of those conversations, because I don't need to have this conversation with every single person. Some people who are not marching on the streets, or who aren't pushing for legislation, or aren't doing other things, your activism can be having a conversation with your auntie or uncle about the current state of affairs and the ways that Asian American people need to come together in solidarity. There was another thing that I was going to say that was probably good, but I can't remember at this moment. But I think one of the things that we just really have to continually challenge ourselves on is, who are we fighting against and who are we fighting for? And if we are fighting against each other in any way, shape, or form, I should reframe that. If we are fighting against each other, which then takes away against the fight for liberation, the fight for equity, solidarity, etc., then we're really just being distracted. I've corrected that, because I still think we do need to fight against some of the problems within our communities. We need to fight against the misogyny, the heterosexism, the classism, the xenophobia, the colorism within Asian American communities that people don't want to talk about. Thank you, Mong, for mentioning that the fact that there are the other Asians, the brown Asians, and we need to talk about that for sure. And that's not disruptive in the same way as, let's say, fighting or promoting anti-Blackness within our communities. We're simply, when historically marginalized subgroups are speaking their truths, we need to address those issues. But when we're fighting against each other without recognizing that it's really what white supremacy wants, and that we are fighting against each other and losing sight of what we want, which is justice and freedom for all of us, then we're really not as effective as we could be. So I'll just stop there for now.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Dr. Nadal. Thank you all. And so this actually brings us to our last question of the panel. And then there might be some questions that might come through the chat. But we have a number of students, faculty, staff, and other members of the community here in today's audience. And so BIPOC students, as we all know, are internalizing, right, these hate crimes, and they continue to receive the message, you do not belong. And so I want us to maybe talk a little bit about briefly how, what we should keep in mind, right, as educators to be culturally responsive, right? Service providers, our counselors, our faculty as mentors, and how can we engage in allyship, right? As scholars, as researchers, mentors, educators.
I guess I'll start first to switch up the order again. One thing that I always notice is that often students come from other classes and the professor's like, the students are really depressed. They wonder at the end of the class, what do we do? Oh, they're really depressed. And I was like, why are you teaching that way? No student of mine ever comes to my class, ever leaves the class depressed or feeling like they're a victim or the whole world's against them. We should be teaching people about beauty and fun and how communities are sexy and cool and interesting. Asian Americans are not victims. They're not quiet. Like, that's how people teach them, but they never teach about how great performers they are, how great artists they are. And that's something I also feel like is missing in the conversation about politics. And we forget that storytellers are masterful because they show us our agency. And it's not just agency, because when people think about aesthetics, it's not just about trying to show your overt agency. You're showing your humanity, your very personhood. So for me, I don't think of my mom as a victim. She is a poor person who grew up very undereducated. If you meet her, she's one of the coolest, the coolest people. Like, you don't want to mess with her. And she's also one of the funniest people you know. And that's what I want to convey, that oftentimes we often think of ourselves as a model minority, silent minority, of people are victim, or we're trying to struggle against white supremacy and we're up against a wall. That's not how I should be teaching it. I think educators, counselors, everyone should be showing the greatness that is the communities in which we are part of and other communities. So that's my last takeaway for all of you.
So I sort of remember what I was thinking about. I think one of the things that is problematic whenever we bring up the KKK is that we then other the KKK as being the real racist, and without recognizing, well, what are some of the ways that we all perpetuate white supremacy, including people of color, but white people especially. And I think that's one of the things that's related to this question, is for people to really challenge themselves to think about the ways that they perpetuate white supremacy. It's not just in obvious ways, things like not being in support of ethnic studies classes, or committing acts of overt racism, or even discriminating against somebody in hiring practices or anything like that. It could be something as simple as the absence of even talking about race in any of your classes. It could be the absence of talking about these horrendous traumas that are happening in our communities right in this moment, and teaching like business as usual. In all of my classes, the very first thing that we start off with when something horrible has happened is for me to say to them, how are you? What's going on? To name what's happening. And I'll tell you that a lot of my classes lately, classes that might not necessarily have elicited tears in the past, they have been eliciting tears, and not just students, but my own. And I think that's part of teaching, that's part of educating, is recognizing that everything that's happening in the world is just as important as your syllabus that you had planned at the beginning of the semester. That it's important to sometimes even throw out that syllabus if there are other things that you can teach, that you could help your students sort through, that you can integrate lessons about as they are applicable to the world. Because what's been happening for a lot of my students is they'll say, this is the first time we talked about the Atlanta shootings. And what was awful about that statement was that I teach class on Monday. And so they went to an entire class or entire week without ever talking about the shootings or the murders because none of their professors brought it up. And we have a significant Asian American population on campus. Students this week have said, none of my teachers, my professors have talked about the Derek Chauvin trial in Minneapolis. And now, presumably, they're not going to talk about the recent death in Brooklyn Center either. And so being a good ally, being a good accomplice, is recognizing that just because you have the privilege of moving on, business as usual, doesn't mean that others have that privilege. That students, especially students of color, are walking around the world with a lot of things that are holding them down. And I don't want to Long's point, like say that they are, all completely depressed, or that they're not able to function. Some of them aren't, but I also want to recognize that that's not the truth for all of them, because for some of them, they're just used to it, that this is just the world that they live in. And so they've learned how to navigate all these things. But I also just want to acknowledge that, for a lot of them, they have a very difficult time continuing business as usual. And so when these professors, educators, therapists, counselors continue business as usual, it really sends this really harmful message to them that what's happening in the world doesn't really matter. And that productivity is more important, or that getting through the day and the things that we had planned was very important, or even just that those events shouldn't really affect you because they didn't really happen to you. I had a friend, Asian American, who went to therapy with a new therapist for the first time, and the therapist said, "What's been going on with you?" And he says, "I'm really affected by the Atlanta shootings." And his new therapist, the first day, the therapist said, "Oh, I didn't realize that would affect you so much." That's harmful. that's destructive, that's not empathetic, that's not being a good ally. And so I hope folks can, create spaces, especially for their students, to name the problems of what is happening, what's going on. Even if you don't know exactly what to say, just trying to say something is better than saying nothing at all. Even if you don't know exactly what to say, just listening sometimes is something that's important. One of the things that I've been saying on a lot of panels this week is it used to be this whole thing of check on your friends, check on your Black friends in the summertime, and now it's check on your Asian friends. But I add a caveat to that. Check on your friends if you're actually friends, because I don't want to hear from you if we haven't talked in 20 years. I'm good. Check on your other Asian friends. But if you don't have Asian friends, then that's what you have to question. Why don't you have Asian friends? Why don't you have Black friends? And what are some of the ways that implicit bias and white supremacy may have infiltrated some of those more unconscious choices as to why you only have white people in your life? And those are the types of things that I think people should concentrate on instead of externalizing that all of the KKK are the only racists in the world. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. I love what you said, and actually, I was going to say a different answer, but you inspired me to build off of you. Robin Kelly gave a speech at the 2018 Association for American Anthropologists meeting. And he was kind of addressing critiques against him that saying that his scholarship, which has, really been oriented towards showing the ways that Black people have imagined other possibilities. And he was addressing attacks of people who called it resistance porn, basically, that saying, he's trying to find agency or whatever where it didn't exist before. And he said, it's not, I can't remember the exact quote, but what stuck with me, he said, the dreaming comes from the despair. That's the part that stuck with me, right? The despair is what produces the necessity to think modes of liberation outside of, reformist temporalities, outside of the ways that are immediately legible. And he shows how people with, people and scholars and activists and just regular old people within the Black radical tradition have always done that. And so what Long said really, really inspired me. It's yes, we want to tell people how messed up everything is, and we should, right? It's not to paint some rose-colored glasses, but what got reported last summer, burning cop cars, burning police stations, these spectacular kind of moments. But what were people also doing? They were building mutual aid groups. They were occupying a hotel to create a place for unhoused people to live. And was that going to ever be sustainable? No, but that's not really the point, right? The point is that these are what people's responses to disaster are. This is why mutual aid was the response to COVID, because it exposes the moment that tells us the state is not going to protect us, so we have to protect each other. And so, ethnic study, kind of teaching ethnic studies, it can be kind of a really depressing thing. But again, Long said, teaching the ways that despair motivates dreaming, I think is just so important in this moment.
Thank you so much. Building on the strength. Thank you, Elizabeth. So this actually concludes our panel for today. Fran, I think we are wrapped up now. It is 4 o'clock. I didn't think that there was any more questions, or I didn't see any, at least on the chat.
I don't have any questions either.
No, there aren't, huh? Okay. Thank you so much, all of you, for your wonderful insights, directives, knowledge, wisdom. It has been a phenomenal panel, and it's been an honor to be able to spend time to coordinate and facilitate.
Thank you, Jeanette, and thank you all so much. Thanks to our fantastic and inspiring panel.